This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here with Damon Centola, who is a professor in Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, also in the School of Engineering, Department of Sociology, and the head of the Network Dynamics Group there at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also the author of two books, this one, the most recent one, called Change, How to Make Big Things Happen, and this other book on how behavior spreads, the science of complex contagions, right? The visual image doesn't really do much for you. But welcome, Damon.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So these books are about network theory, which is, I think, a discipline that is relatively new, relatively recent, and is considered sort of a subfield within sociology. But it's something which we encountered in other disciplines, certainly in marketing, business schools. But there's huge overlaps with epidemiology. And, with the recent coronavirus, there's been a lot of attention that's been paid to kind of network dynamics, infectiousness, and virality of disease. And so this has kind of brought attention back to network theory. And there seems to be a lot of dialogue, a lot of back and forth, and a lot of analogizing between the diffusion of diseases and the diffusion of ideas, beliefs, behaviors, and so forth. Do you think of these as sort of subfields of the same discipline, or do you think that it can sometimes create problems, these analogies between epidemiology and the sociological applications?
Yeah, where my work really picks up is that we've used the disease model from epidemiology for 75 years to describe behavior in various guises, and it's gotten more sophisticated in the last couple of decades, but largely because we actually have a lot of good data on how diseases spread, and we understand fairly well how networks operate increasingly in those contexts. And it makes sense to take what we know and then try to generalize it to the questions we don't know, which are like, how does human behavior change and how do social networks operate, for example, like on the web and on social media. But of course, also in neighborhoods and with the growth of social movements, things like Black Lives Matter, and also things like, now with the vaccine question around the pandemic. And what my work is really focused on is the question, does this disease model really work for studying behavior? And that it's kind of a simple question, but actually led to some profound breakthroughs that the model of behavior really that we had been using since the 1940s. And that's really when network theory and the whole sort of concept of opinion leaders and influencers and all that stuff kind of comes online at the same time. That model actually is wrong. And we just couldn't see it clearly because we didn't have the right kinds of methods in social science. And I think that social science has often been accused by the natural sciences of not being systematic, not being rigorous, not being replicable, right? And so what my work is really focused on in the last 2 decades is developing, large scale, scientific experiments, using methods from physics and biology, to test really our core theories of behavior spreading, of social change, of innovation adoption, and so forth. And the major breakthroughs really have come from the discovery that there's, really 2 different kinds of contagion dynamics. There's, the classic disease model, which is simple contagion. And then there's understanding how behaviors spread, and behaviors do spread. I mean, they really can be contagious, but the contagion model that describes behavior is a completely different model than the one that describes diseases. And that's the model of complex contagion. And so the vast majority of my work in the last decade is focused on really understanding the distinction between simple and complex contagion and how it plays out in, pretty much every domain, innovation, diffusion, the spread of, understanding of topics like climate change, sustainability adoption, and of course around issues in the pandemic, like, the adoption of face masks. And it's conspicuous that you see that the COVID-19 virus, the novel coronavirus, spread really effectively across national borders and across social categories and across political groups. Like there wasn't a problem there. But then face masks didn't, right? Face masks like really clustered by social group and political party. And so it really highlights that there's a distinction to be made between the contagiousness of a virus and the contagiousness of social behaviors. And what my work does is say, look, it can start to feel when you see how all these things don't work the same way as if we have no science. And that's not right either. It's just that the science has now really in the last decade pushed us to the point of seeing what the right model is and what the rules are that behaviors follow. And then all of a sudden it gets really productive really fast. And that's why I wrote the book, is because we had a lot of breakthroughs in the last decade that give us some very useful insights into how to use this new science of complex contagion.
So is it that the old model of simple contagions was wrong, or is it just that the kind of boundary conditions were not recognized, right? That, using this epidemiological model works for certain things, right? In the book, you talk about how, memes, things that don't require any real, kind of commitment or investment by anybody, these things actually do kind of spread in a way that looks like the spread of a disease, right? They kind of flow through these weak ties. Is it just about, figuring out which of these models is the most appropriate one, depending on what it is, or the diffusion of which we're studying?
Yeah, and the reason, in many ways, that the book, Change, How to Make Big Things Happen, focuses on like take-home lessons, is because what people really wanted after I wrote the first book was almost like a playbook of like, all right, what am I looking for? How do I know? And so I wrote it that way, which is, basically, you're looking for certain factors, and you're trying to determine whether those factors are going to play a role in whether people adopt a behavior or not. So credibility is a big one, right? Is there an issue of credibility with this behavior? And if there is, people are looking for social proof. They're looking for what other people are doing. And that factor really matters in terms of the network dynamics in a way that it doesn't affect diseases. People aren't looking for social proof for the disease, right? And that actually plays out in very significant ways. And another one that's probably the biggest one that shows up almost all the time for social contagions is legitimacy, where people are looking really for social approval for a new behavior because it's a new behavior, right? And so this is where change almost always involves being a complex contagion because it's going against what people are already doing. And so one way that I try to highlight it is to say, look, if you have a person who has one contact in their social network who's infected with COVID-19, it doesn't matter how many healthy people they know. All that matters is that one contact with a sick person. But if you ask that same person whether they're going to adopt a face mask, if they have one person who's wearing a face mask that they know, and everyone else they know isn't wearing face masks, and they're aware of that fact, then they're self-conscious about wearing a face mask while they're talking to all their friends and family who aren't wearing face masks. They feel self-conscious and uncomfortable. And that is the nature of legitimacy, is you're looking for, often in implicit ways that we don't ever explicitly talk about, approval from the people around you that what you're doing is normal. And so that's where the influences, or what I refer to as the countervailing influences of the non-adopters, play a really disproportionate role in the spread of social contagions. And that's one of the sort of key things that separates the social complex dynamics of behavior spread from the sort of disease dynamics of simple contagions.
So I was wondering if we could go back in time a little bit, in the earlier days of network theory, and talk about kind of, the popular conception, or at least the
Sure.
most common insight that people take away from network theory, which has its origins with Mark Granovetter and Stanley Milgram, the strength of weak ties. Actually, and I was pleased to see that Mark Granovetter actually endorsed your book, right? From an outsider perspective, I think, oh wow, Damon's just bashing Granovetter's theory, but it's really sort of a compliment to that theory. Could you kind of walk us through that insight, how that insight spread itself, right? It's sort of like a virus throughout the throughout sociology, throughout economics?
Yeah. And this is a kind of a history that I do, briefly in hopefully entertaining way in this book, just to kind of get people into thinking about like what networks are and what we understand about them, is that, it goes back, like I said, to the 1940s. And this is where, some social scientists were trying to figure out how new products spread. Even before that, the same people were trying to figure out how, new candidates become, acceptable to the average voter. What they realized was that, there's all this campaign information that comes out at that point over the radio, or, there's all this product information that comes out over television. And the question was, well, how important is that information? And what they discovered, and this is where networks really come from, is they had this sort of epiphany that actually, the vast majority of that media advertising was not hitting most of the population. It was only landing on a small number of people. And those people were the kind of, very active, engaged, interested people who were like, had these sort of, high media consumption diets. And then those people also tended to be very social to lots of people they knew. And this is where the concept of the opinion leader comes from. And so that gave rise to several intuitions about, spreading in social networks, but none of that stuff was really fleshed out. And it was really, Mark Granovetter, what he did in the 1970s was put the entire field on like a new footing. I mean, his work was a major development in sociology. It's the most highly cited paper in the entire discipline, because it didn't, it's not that it was mathematical, but he formalized it conceptually. He said, these are the core concepts. The concept is, your close friends and family really well. We're going to refer to those as strong ties. And strong here refers to like intimacy, trusts, right? The kinds of things that we find very intuitive when we talk about interpersonal relationships. And then he noticed that the people that you know really well tend to know each other. So then he made this connection between like what we understand intuitively, personally about the people we know, and then this idea of the structure that sits underneath that, which is essentially like a geometry. It's like a bunch of triangles in the social network. The people you know well tend to know each other. And then he contrasted that with the casual acquaintances you have, the people you meet in the airport, the people you sort of bump into. And he said, look, those people don't mean much to us, right? We wouldn't lend them a large amount of money. We wouldn't ask them to watch our kids. So we don't think of them as in our social circle. And we certainly, wouldn't put them on a list of like the top 10 people we know. But then he kind of shifts back to kind of a structural or geometric perspective. He says, but those people, even though they don't mean much to us personally, do this like huge, important work structurally for the society, which is that they have their own cluster of strong ties and you have a cluster of strong ties. And those two groups of people don't know each other. But that contact between you and this person form a bridge or a link across these two distinct groups. And so if there's one sort of set of ideas bumping around in your social circle, then that link between you and this person acts as a conduit for transmission for that idea over to this other group. Now you can see how that's very clearly based on the disease model, right? It would be the same if, someone infected someone else in an airport and they go home and they bring that disease back to everyone else, which is pretty much the same thing as someone getting on an airplane in Wuhan, China, and then getting off an airplane in New York City, right? And so that model was used to describe information spreading. How do we learn about new jobs? Well, the people you know well tend to all know about the same jobs because they all know each other and they all pretty much, have similar lifestyles, things in common. You bump into someone you don't know well, and they're part of a different social network. And so they know about things, openings, opportunities that none of the people you know well know about. And so new job information kind of jumps across the social network to these weak ties. And so the intuition was the strength of weak ties is that they are doing this structural work of bridging like a large and complicated social network full of different groups of people in ways that now connect everyone and allow information to kind of propagate very quickly. So, when Milgram was doing the small world experiment at Harvard, Granovetter was a grad student there. And so, Milgram said, oh, look, I can measure the social distance between all the people in the country. And Granovetter's, deep intuition was, well, Milgram's finding this like 6 degrees of separation, but it's got to be because not because people are all interconnected all over the place, but because people just kind of live in their little social groups, but there are these links across them. And so they weak-ties for those links. And so Granovetter provided like a very deep conceptual foundation for Milgram's intuition about, the small world. And that's why it was so profound, is because it sort of shows up everywhere. But very quickly, as we tend to do, people generalized from the information transmission or, dynamic and that kind of underlying viral story there to everything, right? So that, and Granovetter did too. It was a natural intuition to say, oh, and this is also how social movements spread, right? This is how at that time, they were talking about the civil rights movement. And today we would generalize that right to the Black Lives Matter. But what happened, and this is where my work really picked up, is I noticed that when I was working on these questions in grad school, was that the data from the civil rights movement and from other sort of social change movements weren't showing that weak ties mattered at all, right? Even though those weak ties are there, they just weren't being used. And so that's a kind of a weird problem, which is like, well, if they're not being used, then they don't matter. So why is that happening? And then this is where I realized that it's because those weak ties are super useful for spreading information. But when it comes to mobilizing for like a dangerous or difficult social movement, or adopting a product that no one else is using, or like, switching from traditional family planning to like using contraception, right? All these kinds of things that require like going against what everyone is doing. Just having one weak tie to someone you don't know that well is not going to be enough to convince you to kind of switch your sort of lifestyle. But when people around you start shifting, then all of a sudden that becomes more normal for you too. And I think I can contextualize this more broadly by saying, it's absolutely right. The Granovetter, wrote a very nice blurb for the book, but he's also, Mark is a good friend. And in many ways, he's one of my intellectual heroes. I think that the work he did in the 70s established a new foundation, in many ways, kind of like a new conceptual rigor for social science. And I think of it as a testimony to his intellectual qualities, that when I was working on his work and developing these insights and working on these papers and then developing this book, that he didn't really see it as a threat. He saw it as like an interesting set of new discoveries that he was happy to help champion. And that's the kind of caliber intellectual he is. He actually cares about the ideas more than his own particular reputation. He's a serious scholar, in the sort of grand sense of things. Yeah.
Well, it's funny the overlap also between sociology and economics, because as economists reading this talk about coordination problems, I'm of course thinking about the game theoretic description of the problem, and talking about network dynamics. Of course, here at Silicon Valley, the best way to get funded for a startup is to prove to your funder that the idea you have is going to initiate some network effects. And if you believe the Granovetter story, then the best way to diffuse this new product, this new idea, this new behavior would be to use, as you say, kind of the shotgun approach, right? Plant as many seeds in as wide a dispersed fashion as possible, unless, of course, you have someone who has like a huge number of social ties, weak ties, one of these kind of super spreaders or social influencer, in which case all you need is this silver bullet, and I was just looking at the launch of this new product called Clubhouse. This thing has kind of spread far and wide. Not a lot of people use it. A lot of people downloaded it, and I think their approach was to it seemed like it was a combination of the two, a little bit of a shotgun and a little bit of a silver bullet.
Yeah, Clubhouse required you had to get an invitation from a friend. So they were kind of cleverly targeting this kind of network contagion dynamic, which I think was, a smart way of trying to build their membership. One of the interesting things about what Clubhouse is that it's multiple different things, right? So Clubhouse is, it's kind of, in many ways, it's like a pandemic technology, which is to say a lot of people go to conferences and conventions, right? Like Comic-Con, right? Or whatever thing you go to. But they go to these big events and they come and they sit and like just kind of occupy audience seats while people talk to each other on a panel. And it's fun, I guess, if you're into this topic or that topic, or people go to sports conventions as well and they see famous athletes talk to each other and tell stories, right? And so Clubhouse was set up like that. Like it was basically you'd show up as an audience member and watch some people talk to each other. And so it was a really familiar model of like what this thing is. And then you could come be in the audience for, all these different events. People could also use it to create their own events. And this is a different kind of section of like what Clubhouse would be used for, is to like build your own communities and events. And to my understanding, that's been less successful in terms of like the goal of Clubhouse. And so I think that's telling in terms of like the simple complex contagion dynamic. You tend to see things grow differently depending on like what kind of technology they are and how they're used. And for like, pandemic era convention technology where you can just come in and listen to these kinds of things, then I could actually see that being fairly straightforward as sort of a simple contagion technology. Getting people to build communities and to, share events and to co-create events seems like a bigger ask. And it would be interesting to see how that actually would get built, and how the networks would play a role. One of the interesting things about the internet studies that I talk about in the book, like the study of the spread of support for same-sex marriage or the growth of Black Lives Matter, is that oftentimes the people who study these can document cases where certain things spread like simple contagions and other things spread like complex contagions. Like you can actually draw a very clear line where the dynamics are, for simple memes, people just spread them from person to person exactly in the way that you would expect. But then as soon as there's like just the smallest amount of social risk, right? A great example of this is, tweeting with a hashtag that has a political affiliation associated with it that might be offensive to some of the people that you're connected to. And so people tend to wait until there's more social support and peer reinforcement for that hashtag so that they feel like it's just generally acceptable to use it before they use it. And that's different than just a standard meme in which there's no social risk attached to it. And that's also true for things like the spread of support for same-sex marriage, which people, although they might privately support it, didn't want to come out early on because it was associated with certain groups and they didn't know what it would signal about themselves. But then as they had more and more people adopt in their sort of social network, and interestingly, more and more people from different social circles adopt in their social network, it convinced them that it was like basically a broadly legitimate thing to support. And that the signal of adopting was a signal of supporting this thing generically and not like a personal signal about them. And what's interesting about it is that even though the contagion dynamic spread in this sort of complex way, which seems like it should be slower, it spread to like 2.7 million people in a week, right? So these dynamics can be really quite fast if they take hold of the network in the right way. And that really gets to your question about what I talk about in that chapter that focuses on targeting, or what we call like seeding strategies, which is like how to initiate a kind of critical mass process to get this sort of change off the ground. And yeah, I talk about the shotgun approach, which is basically the viral approach, get, as many different people all over the place as possible. Basically, you want exposure for your idea. That's the intuition. And as you can see, right, intuitively, that's based on the disease model. It's the more people who are exposed to a disease, the more likely an epidemic is going to take off, right? And that's the logic. And then the silver bullet, of course, is just find the special person and sink all your resources into them, and under the assumption that it's going to take more to get that person to adopt. But once they do, then you've got takeoff. And the thing I try to encourage people to do when they're looking at each of these strategies is to say, oh, okay, sure, that works really well for spreading the measles, or, COVID or any other sort of viral contagion. But now imagine that we're talking about spreading like contraception in a population of people who aren't familiar with it and wouldn't necessarily adopt it unless they felt like they were comfortable. Or, talk about face masks or vaccination. The person who's highly connected also has a lot more people looking at them than everybody else, which means they have a lot more people evaluating and ultimately judging their behavior than everyone else. So getting them to adopt early on is actually really quite hard. And even if they did adopt, everyone that they're connected to is also connected to a bunch of other people who aren't adopting the behavior. So the status quo bias is really quite thick in these networks, particularly when you're trying to initiate some kind of change. You can think in the context of social media about like trying to get people to move from Facebook to some new technology. And, Google tried with Google Plus. They exactly tried the shotgun strategy. They're like, we're just going to make everyone have Google Plus, right? We're going to force it on the world. We're going to have like 200 million users in a week. And how could that fail? And it did fail. And that's sort of, I think, should be something that we should all kind of sit up and pay attention to, because it violates in a really conspicuous way, like all of our intuitions about what should work. If you're Google, how could you not succeed? It's like, because if you don't use a social strategy, the sort of standard viral approach isn't going to get you any closer to success than if you're a small startup.
Well, it's true, I think, with Facebook, where they began with Harvard and you had to be a Harvard student to use it. And then ultimately spread to a few other colleges. Whereas I think Friendster, they had some users in Indonesia, had some users in the US, and the user base was kind of scattershot.
Yeah. What's interesting about the growth of Facebook, and there's a very nice study that I talk about in the book that actually looks at the growth of Facebook and then also the engagement, participation in Facebook. And both of those are complex contagions. One of the reasons we do social science isn't just to kind of describe, post hoc what succeeded and what failed, is to be prospective. It's to say, like, here's a theory, here we can use it. But it's also useful to look back and then ask questions about past cases and say, almost using the theory in a prospective way, but with historical data. And to say, okay, so this is what our theory should predict about why Facebook succeeded. Is it true? Can we look at the data through Facebook and interpret? And it turns out that it is true that the way that Facebook spread was through multiple reinforcing ties, and people didn't just sign up right away. They required like multiple people from different social quarters to adopt. And that some of the strategies that Facebook used, just kind of intuitive strategies, actually were these kind of what I refer to in the book. And I contrast the shotgun and the silver bullet approach, which are intuitive for viral contagions, with the snowball strategy. And the snowball strategy is like you target a bunch of people who are clustered together and build a cluster of support, and then have like a bridge that carries that cluster of support to a new community. And that's, the book goes through dozens of different cases where that's succeeded historically, and then also again prospectively, but where people use this strategy to build social media bots and show that they can actually spread things on the web. But that actually describes the Facebook strategy as well, where they kind of focused on a campus, built support on the campus, and they get the multiple connections from that campus, like let's say from Harvard to other campuses that were deeply connected, like Stanford or MIT or Berkeley, right? Were sufficient for then creating social reinforcement that then grew support on that campus. And then that spread to other campuses. And it was this, this kind of growing coordinated support, and then triggering a sort of a change process across what I refer to as a wide bridge. And, as I talk about in the book, right, that's also the way that Twitter spread. So we've got a lot of success stories that follow that model, that even though it looks like, you're kind of limiting your resources at the outset. You're kind of focusing on these clustered groups instead of getting your word out there as far and wide as possible. What you're actually doing is growing this like reinforcing support for something that doesn't just get people to adopt it, but it gets people to stick with it. Because those reinforcing networks are actually become the reason why people don't leave it when Google Plus comes along. Right. And so what you're actually doing is growing commitment in addition to growing adoption.
So this would suggest that the kind of influencer strategy that so many companies use is limited in its potential impact. Certainly with the policies to try and get people to take the vaccine, a lot of these policies have been around, let's get our celebrities to take pictures of themselves, getting the vaccine, and then, broadcast that far and wide through social media. And then this will induce people to go and get it themselves. But you highlight that these kind of influencers or these people with a large number of followers, they can often serve as more of a speed bump than as an accelerant to the diffusion of new ideas.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one of the moments where the book really becomes more prospective than descriptive, right? Because this is exactly what the book predicts, right? Is that you can get the high profile people to adopt. And the only people that will be influential for is the people who are already receptive to the message. So the people who are maybe feeling like, oh, it's inconvenient, I'd get the idea, but then they see an influencer and like, all right, well, that gets them over the hump. But the people who are feeling distrustful of the message itself about vaccination, seeing an influencer only makes them suspicious of that influencer, right? It doesn't change their fundamental receptiveness. And so to drive that point home, you can sort of flip the tables and say, well, if people, 6 months ago, if people are wearing face masks, and imagine people in the sort of, because this was a highly partisan distinction between people who'd wear face masks and those who wouldn't. So imagine you've got like a liberal community of people who are sensitive to all the vaccine issues and they're wearing face masks. And then all of a sudden, Joe Biden stops wearing a face mask. Does that mean all those people are going to stop wearing face masks? No, it means all those people are going to repudiate Joe Biden, right? An influencer can't just do whatever they want, right? They have to be sensitive to the sort of audience they're speaking to. And this is where the bias in a community plays such an important role. And the emphasis on influencers is misguided because it overlooks the fact that influencers are really only influential when they're reinforcing our existing biases, which is another way of saying they're spreading simple contagions. And as soon as they try to sort of push us beyond our biases, well, then we just look to the people around us and we're like, well, that person is, now part of that, institutional message or agenda that we distrust. And so whatever, forget them. And the strategies that are more effective in these cases are to try to, build support from within networks, which is, it's something that people haven't really worried about, except for like grassroots organizers, right? It's the kind of thing that grassroots organizers have thought about for a long time. In terms of the, response to the book, there's certainly a lot of government agencies I'm talking to now who are trying to figure out how to implement this. But the people who should have, responded immediately and just said, I read your book and like, exactly, this is what we've been experiencing over the last 20 years are people who've been doing like grassroots organizing for sustainability or for social change. And they're like, you've described exactly what our experience is. And it's also true for organizational change. I have a chapter in there that builds on these ideas and talks about, what we know about how to change the culture within organizations. And the people who sort of work on those kinds of questions say, yeah, so many of our theories and organizations are based on information transmission. We've always focused on this idea of brokers, as brokerage is hugely important, but those are basically narrow bridges. They're weak ties. They're the sort of information channels across an organization, but they're super ineffective for like changing the culture of an organization. This idea of wide bridges between these different organizational clusters is actually what we found to be the most effective thing. And so now there's like a large theoretical apparatus that provides support for that. But that's, I think one of the things that's most interesting about this is that people have all of these stories. They just haven't had a framework for explaining them,
So you mentioned social proof, right? There's a concept that we use a lot in marketing. And I think a lot of people, when they think of social proof, they think that it's all a numbers game, right? So McDonald's will say over 1 billion, burgers served and that sort of thing. And I think you're saying that the sheer numbers don't matter, right? What matters is the percentage of people that are kind of in your local network, among your ties that are adopting this new behavior. And if that's the case, then when we think about social proof, we have to think about it in a very different way. It's not simply to say, as seen on TV or, as used by the celebrity or, widely adopted. And if you're recruiting, say, for World War I, and you have this wonderful story in there about how the English military recruited, it's not enough to say that, 1 million people have signed up. It has to be, your neighbor signed up, right? Your friend signed up, your cousin signed up. Right.
Yeah. The strategy I talk about there with the PALS battalion, which was ridiculously effective for mobilizing support for World War I. And again, with regard to this, what I refer to as the snowball strategy, is there's sort of an irony, which is instead of, just doing this sort of blanket nationwide campaign, they targeted like neighborhood parochialism. You're sort of, which is the very reason why people wouldn't go to war, because they feel more tied to their neighborhood obligations they do to feel to like the national agenda to sort of, go abroad and fight a war. But by mobilizing campaigns that basically said you can fight with your buddies, the people that in your hometown, then hometowns actually got behind the war effort, and people mobilized together, and generated the largest volunteer army that Britain had seen to date. And I think that's sort of one of the ways that we think about social networks now is that when we talked historically about thresholds, we almost always talked about them as numbers, as you need X percent. You need 2 people or 3 people or 4 people. And what that idea had always been insensitive to is the fact that, like, if you have a lot of people that you're paying attention to who aren't doing this thing, they're this sort of set of countervailing influences. And so the whole notion of complex contagion kind of puts us in mind of that. Now, to be clear, there are conditions where complex contagions only do require an absolute number. So, for example, if we're interested in confirming an urban legend, right? You hear it from one person, it doesn't sound quite true. It's not the same thing as news because it just sounds like, I don't believe that story. We may hear it from 2, 3, 4 other people before we believe that is actually possibly a real story. The reason why countervailing influences don't play as much of a role in that case is because we can't sample all the other people around us and find out whether they know that story, right? The countervailing influences aren't really present in our awareness. And that's different for most norms, right? For most norms, we can see the behaviors people are exhibiting, like face masks is a great example. But also, buying solar technologies, right? You can see whether people put that in their house or not. So, there's a kind of conspicuousness to the non-adoption. And that visibility and that awareness plays a large role in those cases. And in those cases, which is the vast majority of cases, then we're paying attention to that sort of fraction of people because the non-adopters are, even without intending to be, a real sort of social signal that we have to notice in any case where we're thinking about legitimacy.
So a lot of the interventions that you talk about, policy interventions, right, around birth control or kind of market introductions by companies, they sort of accept the network as given, right? People have their ties and you have to figure out how to work with those ties. But within an organization, you can kind of manipulate those ties, right? By making it easier or more difficult for people to communicate. In fact, in management, a big part of business organization is deciding, right, who sits with whom, who gets to communicate with whom, and how we compartmentalize different parts of the organization. And there are a lot of implications for how to do this right from your work. And to get back to your point about kind of creating these bridges, if you're trying to facilitate innovation within an organization, there are ways that you can kind of turn off and turn on communication channels. How do you do this? How do you break down silos, particularly within an organization?
Yeah, I would say that this part of my work is one of the parts that's resonated the most with organizational audiences. And that's basically that the way to think about social networks is to think about social contexts, which is people interact in places. And obviously during the pandemic, we don't have physical workspaces the way we used to, but we typically also still have meetings, right? And so those meetings are virtual meetings. We see other people, we interact with other people. People are brought into teams together, they interact, right? And so that becomes a context for interaction. But, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, we obviously have lots of physical spaces where people interact. We have, I give this story about the food trucks at MIT, right? But so it's like, we have lunch routines that determine the people we interact with and bump into. We have obviously our hallways, which are, where our office is located and the people we bump into. We have our project teams, the people we interact with on those things. And, we also have like our office events that, we used to have a sherry hour. And so these are all locations where people come into contact with each other. And so the thing to think about is like, who are the people that my employees, or depending on the context, my students, right? If we're looking at, organizational administration for universities, right? What are the contexts that are framing their social network? And if we were to change those contexts, so in a really literal way, I mean, taking people's office assignments and changing them, right? So the people that they bump into when they, leave their office are different people. Well, now you're altering in a really deliberate way the pattern of interactions that they're having informally. And you can also change their project teams. And now in a more formal way, you're altering the pattern of interactions they have. And this is something that, this is a set of results I had in a set of papers that, I talk about in the book as well, that was exciting to a lot of people who work in organizational behavior, because it takes the classical approach to organizations, which is often kind of qualitative and ethnographic, people sitting there sort of taking notes or doing surveys and then trying to sort of put it all together and figure out like what the organization is and how it's behaving. And there wasn't a way of tying that to network theory. And so what this work does is provide an overarching conceptual framework, which is actually all of that work is really good at identifying contexts. So once we can actually still do that work as productive, and then we can use it to then describe all the different contexts in which people interact with each other. And then what I developed was a model for taking that and then inferring what the network structure of the population is. And then once we know that, we can talk about simple and complex contagion. We can talk about social influences. We can talk about, the dynamics of contagion and make real predictions about what's likely to succeed and what's likely to fail. And then we can make, again, prospective decisions and say, well, what we'd like to see is that these groups aren't as connected as need to be. We need wider bridges here. So let's rearrange these project teams. Let's change these hallway assignments. And within, an expected period of time. And here the mathematics is useful because you can start to get estimations for like the time scale. Like what's the time scale on which the network will self-organize in a new way? And then that's the time scale in which then we can think about then initiating a change process. Again, the last decade in social science has been very exciting. We can do some very serious work. And again, people who have worked in these spaces have thought about this stuff very, very seriously. And what's really happened in the last 15 years is that the science has basically been put on a new footing by the capacity to evaluate our theories in a way that doesn't just allow us, I think a lot of people have this kind of old fashioned notion that we like falsify theories. Just so you know, that's not true. We don't falsify. Scientists don't falsify theories. It's not true in physics. It's not true in biology. It's not true in sociology. What we do is we take the evidence that we have available And we see where the scope conditions of the theory fail. And, we realize that actually, the parameters that we thought worked don't work. And we kind of just keep reshaping our theoretical ideas. And sometimes that involves rejecting a set of concepts that we had used. And sometimes it involves adopting a new set of concepts, right? So the complex contagion enters the lexicon, and then we can talk about dynamics in that way. And that kind of shifts our orientation. And all of a sudden, everything about like weak ties and influencers becomes constrained, as you mentioned earlier, within like narrower boundary conditions. And we have a broader theoretical model now for describing it. And this scene, there's story after story about the same exact thing happening in physics and in biology. But so the ultimate implication of this is that we can now have a science where we can do, and to my mind, one of the biggest breakthroughs is do experiments. And that allows us to identify causality. And that, to my mind, has been the Achilles heel of social science forever, is that we've been able to look at, historical data and then try to sort of make some inferences about what was happening. But to be honest, without causality, you don't have any kind of policy, right? Because every single policy, organizational policies, public policies, it doesn't matter. Every single policy is a causal claim. The claim is, if I make this change, right, institutionally or in terms of the incentives I give people, whatever it is, that the collective pattern of behavior will, as a result, be changed. That's a causal claim. And unless you can test causal claims, which require experiments, there's not really any way of doing science like that. And so in the last 15 years, what we have now is the capacity to do that in a very systematic way at a large scale. And most importantly, in a replicable fashion, right? So we can show that this works, and it works in a repeated way. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why, again, I wanted to write the book to share with, a broad audience, just how far things have come just in a couple of years,
Well, I agree. I think that's probably one of the most exciting developments in social sciences. We've had experimental economics now for a while, and, now we have experimental sociology, which has definitely has some overlaps. But in experimental economics, we've moved from kind of lab experiments to field experiments. And it seems like in sociology, you kind of rapidly went into the field. And so you did some experiments like the health buddy experiments, where you would kind of architect the networks and kind of see what different impacts you got from these interventions based on how, networks were architected. Maybe talk a little bit about how those experiments are designed and implemented, and to what extent do you think that they can be done on a much, much larger scale? I mean, we know about the large scale Facebook experiments where, they try to get people to vote and expose them to different information from their network. Can we do these kind of large scale experiments in companies, in the field for large scale social interventions? I mean, we haven't seen, for instance, for COVID, we didn't we did not require, the FDA did not require any clinical trials on any of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, right? So, if we're going to do a pharmaceutical intervention, we have to go through clinical trials. If we're going to do a non-pharmaceutical intervention, right, we don't go through clinical trials.
I like that idea. I'm part of this task force for the World Health Organization working on what's called the infodemic, which is the spread of misinformation. So I love the idea of, some sort of, international body doing FDA style trials to approve interventions. There's sort of two big punchlines about this, or maybe a better way of saying it, there were two big epiphanies I had. And epiphany one has to do with the difference between individual behavior change and collective behavior change. And the behavioral economics work is a work that describes, individual psychology and basically says, look, economics has been operating under the assumption that psychology works, particularly microeconomics, right? Microeconomics has been laboring under the assumption that this model of rationality is a decent approximation of human behavior, which to say there are a lot of, I think, unsophisticated critiques of the classical rational model that just say, oh, it's absurd. People aren't like, it's like, well, so yeah, I mean, every scientist makes, assumptions that are abstraction. Newton made absurd abstractions, right? But they really worked very well. And so the logic of science is we use idealization. That's how science operates. So the idea is that, rational choice theory is a nice idealization of human behavior. And it hung around for a couple hundred years, right? It was really the Enlightenment that sort of birthed that formalization, and it seemed to work really well. And I consider it a sort of feather in the cap of economics that they were able to push their method and their thinking far enough to interrogate that, that assumption so effectively that they're able to say this is a false assumption, right? And it doesn't mean, again, theories aren't falsified. It doesn't mean that all of economics goes out the window. It means that that assumption about human behavior doesn't operate effectively under a lot of cases. So now the boundary conditions are shifted and we say, okay, for those cases, we need to understand how human behavior actually operates. But all of that is assuming that people are acting as individuals. You give them some stimuli and they respond. And the one sort of, I would say, shortcoming of this space isn't really a specific problem for behavior economics. It's just that all of this is built on the foundation of psychology. And so that methodological individualism is fine, except that it doesn't really tell us what happens when you put a bunch of people together and have them responding to the stimuli, but also responding to each other, responding to the stimuli. And that complexity is something that's just never been part of the space of economics. They haven't really worried about that. They've done some network studies, but it's always assuming that everyone's responding as an individual to the information. And then there's some, process of adopting, or responding to the other people, again, just as informational signals or strategic signals. But not the broader space of questions about credibility and legitimacy and how that interacts with the ways in which the networks are structured. And so complex contagion becomes informative in that space in terms of thinking about norms in economic decision-making, where norms can be formalized in a fairly rigorous and scientifically usable way, as opposed to just kind of a generic way of saying what people tend to do. So that is a major orientation of my work and was really the reason why I, invented a method, was because I had initially developed this theory of social change and contagion, and there wasn't any way to evaluate it scientifically, right? And I had this, sort of crisis when I came out of grad school, because no one who worked in the space that I worked in had ever tested their theories. It just wasn't a problem for people. You could, write some compelling papers.
Durkheim never did any. But Durkheim,
we don't need to get into that. Durkheim actually didn't. He repudiated contagion entirely. He had a totally different theories. There's there was structure, and then structure just produced behavior. Sui generis. Which is an interesting idea, but it's a kind of a different space. But Durkheim's a nice thing to bring up, though, because what Durkheim tried to do in his book Suicide was, to my mind, very much the aspiration that framed my thinking. Because what Durkheim does is he does this really obsessively careful comparison of societies, right? And he holds all these societies side by side, and he says, well, this society's they're Protestant, but they're like this, and these are Catholic, but they're like this. And he's trying to kind of weed out all the differences and to say, can we find a couple that are basically the same thing, except for this one thing I care about? So you can say what he wants to do is to say, I can hold these two societies side by side. They're otherwise identical, except for this one difference. And you see this massive difference in suicide. And therefore I can infer causally that one thing caused this difference in suicide, right? And, that certainly was my ambition too. But what I wanted to do was to create a method where I could make that kind of causal claim in an experimental way and say, I can
hopefully not related to suicides.
What's that?
Hopefully not with suicide.
I was not studying suicide experimentally, no. When I say that kind of causal claim, I mean, stylistically. But what I was interested in was studying the dynamics of simple and complex contagion in kind of a large scale experimental way. And I was influenced by the fact that I had read some work in population health. And I thought that it was very clever the way that people had kind of shifted from an individual treatment perspective to a population treatment perspective. And they said, look, we always do this thing in public health where we pick the sickest people and we say, let's fix them. But what we're ignoring is that generation to generation, that distribution is staying the same, right? We're just like targeting the low end of the distribution, but the mean is staying the same, which means every generation is sort of reproducing that same distribution with that same low end. So what we should be doing is trying to shift the entire distribution up so the low end of the distribution is actually in the safe range, right? And I found that really compelling. And I thought, well, that's what we want to see. We want to see a contagion dynamic that shifts the entire population. And so, I really believe that you can't study that, without studying each population as its own kind of self-contained entity, which means we can no longer study individuals one at a time and then say, well, and then let's just aggregate post hoc and say that with this, you study, 1,000 individuals one at a time, and then you just imagine, put them all together and you get, some aggregate or some kind of, amplifying quotient or coefficient. Sorry, there was a term for this that economists have developed, like the social magnifier or something. But it basically is a coefficient you multiply times individual effects and say, this is your social effect. And I felt like it was just sort of wrongheaded in the sense that I'm not repudiating economists, because I feel like that there's a lot of excellent work that I use in my thinking. But I think that particular assumption is the wrong assumption, because what we really want to do is we want to look at the dynamics of how people interact and then what the ultimate aggregation process yields in terms of the collective behavior trajectory. And the real sort of goal was to show that if we were to intervene at the network level and change the network properties of the sort of interactions among people, we would produce radically different outcomes, even though the distribution of people in the network were the same people. So we're saying, look, psychologically and in terms of all the properties that we think matter, these people are the same. And in terms of like the stimuli or the thing that we're spreading, the technology is the same, right? So the only thing that's different between these two different worlds is the kind of pattern of connectedness, which people don't actually see. They never see the network structure. They just see, people interacting, and that's what they, kind of just like we do. We see our friends and we kind of know who they're connected to, but beyond that, we haven't a clue what the network looks like. And to be honest, unless you're a networks geek, you really don't care what the network looks like. Who spends our time thinking about that except for like us network scientists, right? So the point is that these features of society, despite the fact that they're invisible and we don't care about them, are nevertheless causally important. And that's where the intervention question comes in. And so, the second epiphany I had was that if I wanted to study real behavior, instead of build an experiment, create a stylized kind of experience, and then collect the data I wanted, but just to say, well, look, if what I'm really interested in is studying the dynamics of social propagation, I should just be able to imagine a space where that's really happening. And I had something in my head like the biosphere kind of experiment that people had built, where they kind of put a bunch of humans into a self-contained environment and just studied how they behaved. And interestingly, it actually was self-sustaining biologically, but it fell apart for social reasons. And so that was the way I was thinking about it. Or the other analogy I like to use is like a petri dish, which is to say, well, when you're growing penicillin, you really just want to like study that petri dish and sort of watch the sort of responsiveness of this fungus to whatever bacteria is there. So could you imagine doing that in a way that would allow us to replicate petri dishes and show that we can, every single time we make this intervention, the petri dish grows this thing in the same way? And so I landed on a health community, but we've also done this in like, all different kinds of communities. You can do it with a bunch of people investing in stocks. You can do it with people shopping for, products. It's the same dynamics in each case, is that you connect people to each other in a space where they're doing something that they would do anyway. And then just sort of watch their behavior evolve. And to my mind, one of the most exciting things about our day and age is that social scientists, particularly sociologists, who are studying these kind of collective network dynamics, no longer have to make excuses about external validity, right? You don't have to say, I did design this weird experiment with this stylized model. I had people do the prisoner's dilemma, but actually it applies to all these other things. You can just say, look, I studied people adopting a health technology in a context in which people were there to adopt health technologies. Also, it happened to be an experiment, and yes, absolutely informed consent was given. I think that ethics is a huge part of this, not just in data collection, but also in like how we think about this work. But we can create these real spaces, and health winds up being very nice because I ran this, through the Harvard Center for Cancer Prevention. And so, there's a lot of people, and I mean like hundreds of thousands, who come to that website just looking for like health advice. And if you offer them an opportunity to join a health community, they'll do it because they think it's interesting. And to me, that is exactly the right way of studying human social behavior, is you just find stuff that people think is interesting and you study it. But if you can do that in a controlled experimental way, wow, that's why it's a new era of doing social science. Yeah.
So a lot of people I've interviewed have talked about social capital and kind of the importance of social capital, of understanding the type of social capital you have in your society and your organization. And I think what you're proposing is really the promise of a science of architecting social capital, not only within organizations, but potentially within societies. Do you think that the people who are potentially interested in this are the folks who are doing it for good? Or you mentioned that the folks who really are onto this are oftentimes doing it for various reasons, right? So you talk about the 50 Cent party in China. Do you think that there really is the prospect of a science of architecting social capital that we can use to advance positive policy goals at the national level and kind of positive corporate goals at the corporate level?
I think there is, and I think it's being used already. I do, as you can imagine, quite a bit of consulting. Sometimes for governmental organizations and NGOs who always have the best intentions.
And for the 76ers.
The 76ers. Yeah. And that's a good example. When the 76ers called me up, like, I think about those cases, right? Do I care about having the 76ers win? Is that something that's important to me? And is that, what am I doing ethically by, investing in a sports team and helping that team to make better scouting decisions? Does that sort of hold up to the standard of the application of social science that I think that we should, as serious people, care about? And the reason I did the project was because one of the, to me, interesting upshots of the project was to be able to understand the impact of these technologies, which work and have been replicated in lots of different cases, on how people kind of feel about their relationships with others, particularly in a fairly hierarchical environment like, professional sports. And I wanted a better understanding of that. And I felt like, first of all, it seemed valuable to me intellectually, but also it seemed to me like a good thing to know whether or not people were sort of feeling some sense of personal benefit in addition to sort of what we were seeing in the improvement in collective intelligence and decision making. And as I described in the book, when I talk about the work I did with the Sixers, I actually learned a lot about how people experience these kinds of network effects and even the degree to which they feel empowered by them, which I hadn't anticipated, but was really, really useful to sort of see. Because a lot of the work we're doing now applies this science to the challenge of vaccine hesitancy, like in the African-American community, which is one of those places where you feel like, well, I don't just want to convince people to adopt a behavior. I'm not interested in like tricking them or nudging them to do something. I'm interested in creating like more empowered, more engaged relationship with public health. And so learning how these technologies affect people's thinking about themselves and their relationship to the opportunities that are in front of them, I think is really valuable. And I think for all social scientists, it's important to be selective about the ways in which their work is applied. I also think that one of the questions that I would get a lot when I first published that book was, isn't this incredibly dangerous? Like, should you be publishing these books and papers? Because you're basically giving people a recipe for how to manipulate populations. I give the example of subliminal messaging and like the fact that we did a bunch of science around it. But the point is, the science gives some like really specific instructions about how to do subliminal messaging. So that's dangerous. But the science also allowed us to regulate subliminal messaging because we could identify the exact frequencies. And without that, you can't regulate it, right? And the assumption has to be that competitive organizations are trying to figure out how to do this stuff all the time. And they're probably going to figure out, some haphazard thing that kind of works sometimes and not others. But to the extent that they're capable at all of social manipulation, we want to be able to detect it and regulate it because that gives us a better society. And I think that that's true for network science as well. The extent to which we can improve our understanding of the science certainly allows us to do better public policy, but it also allows us to anticipate cases where it might be abused and then to be, I think, a little bit more vigilant in our sort of relationship with places like Amazon and Twitter and Facebook. And when I consult for these companies, I make that clear that that's my position on this, so that there's no ambiguity about like what my role is there. I feel like it's fine for me to help out, but I also believe that there should be a certain level of accountability with this kind of science as well.
Well, there's lots of great other insights in the book and speculations, ranging from Amazon's 2 pizza teams all the way to the rise of Europe. It fits the early modern period, from the microscopic to the macroscopic. Lots of fascinating insights. I recommend both of these books, How Behavior Spread and also Change. Damon, thanks so much for joining me. Appreciate it. Hope to connect at some point in person.
This is Unsilo, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.